Wight Noise, Chapter 1, Section 5, At least it's Friday. She woke the following day, which was Friday. The county had it set up for students to return from summer break by having them come in for a short week. This would allow the students time to recover the changes of their schedules and getting back into the groove of things. Anne was glad that it was Friday. She hated school and always had. When she was in elementary school, she had quite a few problems with bullies and a lack of friends there to stick up for her or comfort her after the fact. Middle school was about the same for her, but her attendance was something her mother began getting letters about, and Anne had to push her way through the rest of the school year, tears or not. Anne would begin thinking that people were talking behind her back, even when they were not, because it had happened so many times. She trusted very few and hid most of herself away from the world to protect herself in her own shell. She was a Cancer, after all. It was time to get ready for school. Anne sat on the bathroom sink with the light off to avoid seeing her ugly crying face and straightened her hair as she did so. She needed to make sure that she got all the tears out before it was time to leave. Most of the kids she went to school with within her earlier years had moved away or had completely forgotten about her and ceased bullying. She wanted it to keep this way, and not to resurface old habits in others. She had cried all that she could and wiped her eyes on her oversized t-shirt that she normally wore to bed. Turning the light back on, her eyes were puffy and red. Her cheeks were flushed. There was no purpose in putting makeup on today since her eyes wouldn't turn from their deep pink back to a light ivory before she left.
Screw it.
Violet had recently discovered that she was pregnant. The father was someone that Anne went to school with in junior high when Violet first met the boy. Violet was nearly a month along now, but was not showing yet. One of the reasons for this was the fact that Violet would starve herself when she was unhappy, though she claimed that she just wasn't hungry. Anne knew better. The father, Bryce, was the same age as Anne, but older by a few months. Anne and Bryce were only 14 at the time. Violet was 17. This did not make Anne look good. She had picked up a common filthy name from those who had taken favor of harassing her due to the new knowledge of her sister's pregnancy, calling Anne a whore. While Anne finished getting ready for school, she took her red jacket from her bedpost and tied it around her waist. Though it was August and humid, she felt safer wearing it. She also wore it for comfort, knowing that it would be more difficult for someone to check out her bottom.
Anne, come on!
Violet shouted as she shut the door. Anne quickly grabbed her backpack and swung it over her shoulder as she ran from her room, through the dark hall, and descended down the steps into the foyer before darting out the front door. Anne took her seat in math class as she rummaged in her bag for her math book. She pulled the thick book from the bag and flopped it onto the desk with a sigh. She saw movement at a desk nearby from the corner of her eye. It was the familiar face of Sebastian. He looked at her as if she had just tried to stab him with a pencil. With a huff, he grabbed his books and plopped them down on the desk next to hers with an accusing expression.
Oh, so you're too good to sit with the cool kid now?
Turning back to her math book to find the section they would be covering today, she casually responded, "Oh, sorry, I didn't realize you were a cool kid." He stared at her a moment in awe that she, of all people, had the audacity to speak to him that way. Before he could argue further, Fat strolled into the classroom, scanning the room until he located Sebastian. Fat took his seat in front of Sebastian. This made a lump in Anne's throat.
Both switched?
Hey guys, Fat yawned. His hair was a tangled mess. It appeared he had woken up, gotten dressed, and left for school within the past 10 or 15 minutes. This was likely the case, from how bloodshot his eyes were and the dark curtains that hung under them. Either this or he had not slept well the night before. Anne wondered if this was usual for him and if he was okay. She did not know him well enough to ask, but allowed Sebastian time to check, and she would eavesdrop. Anne peered at the clock hanging on the wall above the classroom door that displayed 8:01 a.m. The teacher had not yet made it in the class. This was an opportune time for students to chat with their neighbors. Sebastian and Fat did the same. Anne took out her spiral notebook where she had taken notes from yesterday and pretended to study them while she listened in on their conversation. Their faces were close together and speaking barely above a whisper. "Yeah, man, I just wasn't happy. I finally broke it off." Fat spoke in a low tone. She was a bitch anyway, dude. Fuck her. Fat did not respond right away. The statement seemed to be true and not simply just a personal opinion of the blonde. However, the lack of response seemed to agree in his tired state. The boys then lowered their voices and continued on. Anne was not someone who could read lips well, but could seldom manage. She was still able to make out bits and pieces of what they were saying. "Cute, isn't she?" Sebastian whispered. Anne was unable to make out the rest, but she noticed the low tone that he spoke in earlier had somehow gotten even lower than she thought someone could make their voice at that age. "All right, class, enough chit-chat," the teacher shouted. She twirled a pencil in her fingers as she walked in and shut the door behind her. Anne had all of her items packed away in her backpack before the bell rang to dismiss first period. Once class was over, the room cleared out fairly quickly except for Anne, Sebastian, and Fat. The boys did not have their items packed, but instead they slowly got their things together and did so in a way that irked Anne. Pages were bent in the books, though it was only the second day of school, along with whole sheets of paper folding in half when the book closed. Some of the loose pieces of paper dangled partially out of the ends of the book. Both of the boys were fairly big, much more than Anne, so she impatiently waited for them to gather their things and move so she could. She had not chosen a wise seat this time. They had her blocked in a corner where she could not maneuver around them. Sebastian and Fat began talking animatedly as their voices escalated steadily with excitement. They were discussing a Dungeons and Dragons game they had played over the summer. Sebastian stepped on a stray pencil that someone had left behind. The pencil rolled under his shoe and caused him to fall into Fat. Fat was able to stand his ground and saw quickly that it was an accident, but used this opportune time to shove Sebastian for fun. Sebastian, once he caught his footing, shoved Fat with his free hand. Fat dropped his math book and his papers flew about, sailing through a small radius around him. He gave Sebastian a look of obvious contempt by firmly pursing his lips and narrowing his eyes on the slender kid. Fat then flung his hand out in Sebastian's direction, and this time caused Sebastian to topple over one of the desks behind him. He fell backward, dropping his book, which did in the same manner as Fat's had. His pencil flew across the room and ricocheted off the wall and on the legs of another desk nearby. The desk Sebastian had toppled over turned over on its side with a ridiculously loud bang, causing the teacher to jump and shout at them. The boys proceeded to leave but laughed loudly when the teacher tried to complain. Anne's face had set into a wildfire red as the loud bang from the desk caused several students out in the hall to peer in and investigate the sound. Anne was still sitting in her desk with her backpack strapped on, but completely still and silent. Sebastian had already exited the class. Fat turned and glanced at Anne over his shoulder before disappearing into the crowd. It was finally lunchtime. Since Anne had starvation lunch, it meant that there was only one more class to attend and then she would be free for the weekend. She stood in the dreadfully long line leading into the cubby area of the cafeteria where the food was being served. Today they were serving hamburgers and corn dogs. She decided on the hamburger, and like all hamburgers at school, it was as dry as they came, along with a few crinkle fries on the side to go with it. She noticed right away that the grease from the french fries was seeping out and creating a small pool in the styrofoam tray compartment. Watching this made her stomach turn. On her way to the registers to pay, she snagged a couple packets of condiments. She paid for her items and located a table to sit down at alone. Though the lunch periods were split into 3 sessions, the cafeteria was still overcrowded, and there were never any free tables available. Today was Anne's lucky day. She sat down at the booth on the far left wall closest to the office and began preparing her food. She pulled the bun off of the dry burger and poured mayonnaise and ketchup on the burger, smearing it with one of the empty packets to even out the condiments, then replaced the bun. She emptied the rest of her ketchup packets on a separate area of the tray for dipping her fries. This time, she kept her head down and hoped no one would try to come sit down with her. She was still very much too nervous to be meeting any more new people and get herself into any other coincidental situations, as she did yesterday. Sebastian and Fat located her within 15 minutes. They noisily made their way over to the booth. Fat sat down on the bench opposite of Anne, while Sebastian took the side Anne was on by using his hip to bump her close to the wall. She let out a, "Hey!" This gave her little room. Sebastian pushed her tray to the wall, causing her milk carton to turn over and dumping milk into her ketchup. She picked it up quickly, but the ketchup was ruined already. Some of the milk had splattered on her fries and her burger as she let out a sigh. Anne sat listening to the boys conversing back and forth while she ate silently and kept her eyes down on her damp food. She was worried about making eye contact with Fat. He had been staring quite often, which made her uncomfortable, and she tried to avoid it. They had not said a word to her since they sat down. When she had finished her food, she tapped Sebastian on the shoulder.
Hey, I need to throw my tray away.
Sebastian turned to her briefly with a scoff, followed by a low chuckle.
No.
Anne sat there a moment confused.
Why? 'Cause?
He turned and took a large bite from his burger and dropped several crumbs into his lap.
I'm not done yet.
He managed through the halfway chewed food.
Well, can't I just get by and you can finish once I'm out?
Sebastian swallowed audibly. He slowly turned.
I said no.
Anne tried to hold back the tears from the minor scald. All she wanted was to get out of the overcrowded cafeteria, away from all the noise and sounds of indistinct voices murmuring, yelling, laughing, and filling the room, bouncing around on the walls. It was not the only thing causing her to grow miserable, but the fact that Sebastian had been rude to her and in front of his friend. She felt that school would always be this way, whether it was a friend or someone she did not know, who made her hate being here. Once Sebastian finally finished his meal, he stood abruptly and tossed his tray several feet away from the garbage cans. He made the tray for the most part, but the stray fries that were not eaten went flying and bouncing off the garbage can into the floor. Anne looked at him, wondering if he was going to leave them there. Sebastian met her glance, and he looked at her boredly. He answered her silent question by slightly shaking his head. Anne said nothing. Fat had gone over to the other garbage cans, threw his tray away, and headed for the restrooms. Once Fat had turned the corner into the nearest hallway with a bathroom at the opening, Sebastian stopped Anne from leaving. He motioned for her to stand behind one of the pillars that separated the openings in the cafeteria. The pillars were at least 9 feet tall and 4 feet wide. Neither of them could be seen from the cafeteria. Sebastian leaned in to Anne and whispered, "Hey, I gotta talk to you about something serious for a minute."
Okay.
"Fat likes you. You should go out with him," he suggested. Anne stared wide-eyed. Like most who have feelings for another, there's always a tiny flicker of hope that remains, even when turned down. Sebastian essentially spit on the small flame of hope.
Go out with your best friend? Someone I just met yesterday and claims he already likes me? This isn't right.
She thought.
Wait, he just broke up with his girlfriend. Oh boy. Shit.
"Why?" Anne asked. "Well, I don't know, Anne. He likes you. I can see it, and he's not stopped talking about you since I introduced you to yesterday," Sebastian stated as he stood straight again. "But I don't know him," Anne began. She stopped mid-sentence when she saw Fat searching for them when she peered around the pillar. She decided she would cross that bridge when she came to it.
Look, I gotta go. My class is on the other side of the building, and I'm gonna be late.
She turned and bolted down the hallway before Sebastian could get another word in or spotted by Fat. She reached Composition 1 feeling as though she might vomit. What Sebastian had said continued swirling around in her head. Tiffany was in this class and would be walking in any minute now. Anne quickly took her seat, pulled her supplies out, and put her head down on her desk with her arms around her head to hide her face, but strategically placed her hair over her arm on a small area where she could peek through to see. Due to the series of events that took place the way that they did, Tiffany would think that this was all Anne's doing. Tiffany walked into class immediately glaring at Anne. Tiffany turned sharply and sat in the furthest row away from Anne and continued staring resentfully. When class began, Anne ensured not to look Tiffany's way, but would sneak in peeks to see if she was still death staring. Not to Anne's surprise, Tiffany continued shooting Anne dirty looks throughout class. Anne tried to appear as if she took no notice and watched the clock tick ever so slowly towards 3 p.m. The bell rang for school dismissal. Anne waited for Tiffany to leave class first and pretended to be distracted by organizing her notes from class and putting them gingerly into her binder. Tiffany would have likely approached Anne and said something, but the teacher was at his desk, close to where Anne sat, grading papers. Anne had overheard that Tiffany rode the bus, so she could not wait forever for Anne to finish up. After several minutes, Tiffany dropped her act of putting on makeup and using a small purse mirror with a heavy sigh. She shoved her makeup and mirror back into her purse, flung it over her shoulder, and stormed out the door. The teacher looked up, wondering what the stomping was all about, and noticed Anne was still in there. Anne was just zipping her backpack. She swung her backpack over her shoulder and took off. Coming to the main entryway of the school, she turned the corner to head towards the east wing double doors when she spotted him. He was in the same spot that he had been yesterday. She made no attempt to hide from Fat. Anne walked steadily through the crowd and through the double doors, but never looking his way. Anne made it out to the door. Fat did not try to stop her, but watched until she disappeared into the parking lot. Section 6. Friday evening. Anne arrived home at 1/2 the hour. Violet had listened to music the whole way home and spoke little to Anne, other than asking how her second day of school was. Anne made her way into her bedroom, shut the door behind her, and settled in the middle of her floor. She finished her homework as quickly as she could, then allowed her mind to unravel for the day. Anne peered around her room, then decided she would work on a drawing she had started several weeks ago. She was not in the mood, but it was something to do. For one, she did not like the idea of someone liking her that knew her for only 2 days. That seemed far-fetched to her, but then would recall how he would watch her.
Something is weird about this, and I feel like Sebastian's telling me the truth when he says the guy likes me, but something seems off. And the blonde, what am I going to do about that? I'm sure she's convinced I was the one who did this. God, this is ridiculous. I've been in school 2 days. How does this even happen?
Anne dropped her pencil and laid her head down on the beige carpet in her room and stared out at the clouds slowly floating past. She noticed it was already beginning to get dark out.
What am I going to do?
Little did Anne know, this was the beginning of a dangerous game.